What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. Today I want to do a video discussing why I always try out every different option and what my process is of trying out options with players before I decide to cut ties with them, whether that be through a trade or through releasing that player. Generally, this is going to apply to underperforming players, players that aren't meeting your expectations, maybe players that are coming towards the end of their contract. And I feel like the general consensus is users in Madden tend to be very quick with parting with players that they see or perceive as underperforming, that they decide are not living up to expectations or aren't worth the contract that they could potentially be getting down the road. And so I just want to talk about my philosophy today, and I want to talk about some of the things that I do in order to make sure that I really want to part ways with that player, because these players are important investments to your team. You know, you draft them for a reason, you sign them for a reason because you believe that they have the potential to do something for you. And on top of that, we've done all these videos lately talking about the financial implications of cutting and trading players and how it affects your cap penalty. And really, you can get yourself into a financial bind by cutting and trading away too many of your players and cutting away players that have a lot of money left on their contracts. And so my theory behind it is I want to always try out every single possible option that I can to have success with that player prior to moving on from them. And, you know, essentially what that starts with is moving them around within the depth chart and then moving them around within different positions and trying them out at various different positions and trying them as a CPU controlled player and trying them as a user controlled player. And maybe they have different impacts to your team at various different positions. You know, for example, Jonah Williams might perform better at right tackle than he performs at left tackle. And, you know, it might be worth giving him a contract because of how he performs at right tackle. But I wasn't thinking about giving him a contract at his performance level at left tackle because he wants so much money or something like that. And so I'm going to go through today some of what I do with these players in order to get better performance out of them. And, you know, some of the top ones that I want to talk about specifically, you know, wide receivers. A lot of people think wide receivers are a dime a dozen. I have a very similar view on that, but this is one of the most common positions where you see players underperforming and then people are quick to trade them away or release them or let them walk and not re-sign them to a contract. Well, chances are most people haven't done their due diligence with these guys in order to utilize them to their fullest potential. You know, the three various different positions at wide receiver on the depth chart have extremely different impacts on the game and how they're involved with you throwing them the football. So, you know, if I have a player as the number one wide receiver on the team and they are constantly not getting open, not getting receptions for me, not getting touchdowns, not getting yards, it might not really be their fault. And you have to consider some of the factors that are going into that. If they're the number one receiver, for example, maybe they are drawing the number one cornerback at all times from the defense. Maybe they are placed in those routes that are considered the attention routes, the routes that are, you know, the primary go-to on a play, and that's just not something that fits their role. You shouldn't, in my opinion, simply cut or part ways with that player because they're underperforming in that role. What I would first start by doing is I would start by taking, for example, Tyler Boyd, if he's not working out well in that number one wide receiver role, and I would put him at the number two wide receiver and see if that makes a change, see if that gets him involved differently, because the number one wide receiver and the number two wide receiver run significantly different routes on any given play. And this is just one positional example. And then outside of that, you can do various other different things. Let's say you have a top end wide receiver that's not getting involved in the game. The best way to get them involved is placing them at the slot slot wide receiver position. And this is something that people overlook all the time, is who they have playing at their slot wide receiver position. Because right here I have the speedster John Ross playing at the slot position, but generally speaking, whether you are simulating or whether you are actually playing the games, the slot wide receiver is going to see a volume of the targets because they're going over the middle. They're running those short routes that are easy dump offs and things like that. So maybe try putting that receiver that is underperforming into that slot wide receiver role and see if that changes your offense. That could help out the receiver that was already playing in the slot wide receiver role, but more importantly, it can help out your player that is potentially underperforming. And this is something that I see so often, and I'm going to just kind of regurgitate the same saying here, is that people don't move their players around in order to decide whether they're actually worth getting rid of or not. I hopped into that 32-man RDFL league and people were ready to get rid of their players left and right because they weren't playing the way that they wanted them to. Well, they probably had, the guy that was the Browns traded OBJ right away because he wasn't performing well. Well, he probably wasn't playing him in all of the different roles that he could possibly be playing in. And so for some positions like wide receiver, that's easy. For offensive line, I also see that as pretty easy. If a guy's not performing at left tackle, well, the duties at guard, center, and right tackle are different than the duties at left tackle. Your left tackle is mainly considered a pass blocker. He's going to be protecting the blind side of your quarterback. A lot of people complain about their tackles not doing what they want, not blocking effectively enough. Well, have you tried moving them around? Have you tried at least swapping them back and forth to see if you can get better production out of them? And then the other thing that I want to talk about here in addition to this, before I go through some of the other positions, is you have to understand that there are so many things going on behind the scenes, and we know this for a fact based on conversations with game developers and things that they've said. We know that there are so many things going on behind the scenes with these players that a position switch could potentially trigger a better play from that player. So while Daniel Falele might not be playing great at right tackle, I could switch him to maybe left tackle, and that could trigger something behind the scenes that's going on with the game, and it could trigger him to play absolutely phenomenally. We've talked about in so many of my videos the players that are, basically scripted by the game to play better than their overall and things like that. More often than not, I will see players switched from one position to another have an uptick in performance because it changes something that is going on with that player, whether it be morale-wise, whether it be some type of flip or some type of switch that gets flipped behind the scenes that just triggers that player to play better at another position. You have to consider these things and start to try to move your players around before you make that harsh decision to move on from a player, because like I said, that can have huge implications to your salary and things like that. Now, from the offensive perspective, like tight end, fullback, you can't really move those guys around too much. You're obviously not going to be moving your quarterback around or your halfback around, but you can get your halfbacks involved differently. You can get them involved as a power back, a third down back, guys that are catching the ball out of the backfield, various different things like that. You can get them involved differently. But where I see the biggest impact from moving players around, in correlation with their performances on the defensive side of the ball. There are so many people that will come to me and say something like, man, I got this super good X factor pass rusher and they're just not getting any sacks at their position. And the first thing that I always say to them, I've had people in my leagues come to me and say, can I trade this guy? He's a 95 overall and he's only gotten 3 sacks for me on the season. The first thing I always say to these guys is I always say, have you tried them at a different spot on the defense? Have you tried Gregory Rousseau at outside linebacker? Have you tried him playing rushing D tackle? Have you tried him on the opposite side? Something as simple as flipping him from left end to right end could yield a huge uptick in performance. And like I said, this goes hand in hand with us knowing that there are things that go on behind the scenes with the game. And so if you are not seeing the production out of these players, start to move them around. You are not doing yourself any favors by leaving them where they're at and complaining about their lack of performance and their lack of production. Simply take them, and you don't have to do huge moves with the players. Like I said, you could do something as simple as flipping Gregory Rousseau and Carl Lawson. It starts with depth chart, and it goes all the way up to moving their positions. So at the base, just flip them on the depth chart. And if that doesn't work, then legitimately go in, click edit the player, and flip them to the other side. Go in and click edit player and flip them to the other defensive end position or the other outside linebacker position. And that in itself at times is enough to trigger better play from that player. That will do enough in order to generate more sacks, in order to generate more pressure, in order to get that player kicking into the backfield and creating disruption in the run game. And I've seen it time and time again, and I just wanted to express to you guys how important and what are some of the factors that are going into this, that it's a process that I am regularly doing. Before I decide to give a guy a contract or not give a guy a contract, before I decide to cut a player or trade a player based on their performance or anything of that nature, I move them around. You guys also probably saw it in the RDFL league if you paid close attention to it, that 32-man user league. I had a couple of defensive backs that weren't playing up to my standards, and so I moved them around. I took my free safety and moved him to strong safety, took my strong safety and switched his position to free safety, and they started playing better. I took a certain cornerback and put them in the slot and bumped another cornerback out to the outside, and they started playing better. And, outside of just simply making these decisions on a whim, there are so many things that you guys can do with these players if you start to get creative to get them involved before you make some type of rash decision that could hurt you in the future. So, hopefully this discussion video helped you guys in some way. Hopefully it gave you maybe some things to think about in the future whenever you're making these decisions with your players, because these are not decisions that I take lightly if I'm in a committed franchise. I don't simply part ways with a player just because they're underperforming. I do everything I can on my end to try to get the most out of my investment. Gregory Rousseau, for example, if I invested a first-round pick into that player, I am not simply going to part ways with that player just because he's not getting enough sacks for me. I am going to do everything I possibly can to get this guy involved and try to trigger something within the game that is going to trigger a boost in performance from him. And like I said, hopefully this, gets you guys thinking, maybe gets you guys some new ideas as to things you can do to incorporate these players into your gameplay. And, you can base these decisions off of so many of the other videos that I've made in terms of gaining mismatches and, which stats matter at specific positions. You can utilize those videos and your knowledge of the game in order to decide, where should I move this player to try to get some more out of him? Where should I move this player in order to try to get an uptick in production? So with all that being said, make sure you guys leave a like on the video if you did like this discussion type of video. Make sure you guys subscribe to the channel if you're new. Hit that bell notification button and comment down below. What do you guys do with your players that you're ready to move on from or that are underperforming? Do you guys try to move them around and get more out of them before you make a decision like that? Or do you just say, hey, they're underperforming, let's part ways. I'll try to bring in somebody else that'll perform for me. And that's that. Let me know all that in the comment section. What do you guys do? And I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a good one.